In this video, we're going to be looking at a full sample answer to the task card we were looking at for part 2 of the IELTS speaking test in last week's video. Of course, in that video, we went through the planning stage for that task card, and we came up with some ideas for each of those cues. And we also came up with a few bits of vocabulary that I thought would be useful to add to our answer. Now, of course, when I'm giving the sample answer today, we're going to be following that plan, going through each of those cues one by one and expanding on each of them as much as we can before we move on to the next one. Now, of course, this isn't the only way to give an answer in part 2 of the IELTS speaking test, but I always find it's quite a useful approach to have to follow those cues in order and to expand on each one as much as you can before moving on to the next one. It's really going to help you to keep moving forward and not repeat yourself. And also it's giving a kind of logical structure to your speaking. And hopefully it's going to be helping you to fill that 2 minutes whilst keeping a good level of fluency. So that's why we're kind of following this kind of technique. Of course, you don't have to, but it might be something worth practicing. So we'll go through the full sample answer, and then afterwards I'll give a quick analysis of some of the good features of this answer that mean it's a really high level response, the kind of response that of course a native speaker would give, so some of those really high band scores. Now let's have a look at the full answer. When I was in my childhood, I grew up in a town just south of London. The specific neighbourhood was just outside the town centre. There was a big road running from the high street past a big park, and my road was on the right straight after passing the park. It was actually a dead end, so I suppose you could call it a cul-de-sac. This made it a quiet area as cars would rarely drive down the road. The people living there were mostly young middle-class families, although there were a few older retirees in a few of the houses. The parents were often commuters, travelling into London every day to work, and their kids would go to a nearby school just walking distance from the neighbourhood. The area was very pleasant. Both sides of the road were lined with Victorian semi-detached or detached houses, and it felt like a pretty tight-knit community. Children would often be playing together outside, and it seemed like everyone knew each other quite well. There'd occasionally be issues with parking, but this was usually when outsiders came to park their cars to have easy access to the town. It was close to the shops and next to the park, and people often came to take advantage of the convenient parking. Unfortunately, this would sometimes cause confrontations between locals and the strangers who came to park there. I can't imagine I'd go back to live there again. My parents have moved out of the house to live somewhere else, and the houses there are a bit too pricey for me. However, if I did get an opportunity to live in the area, I might consider it. So there we go, that's the full answer there. Hopefully nothing seemed too complex there to understand, but it should have been a nice full answer that was focused on that task card and going through each of those cues and expanding as much as we could to maintain that fluency and keep speaking for around 2 minutes. Now, what I'll do is just go through the full answer sentence by sentence, just pointing out a few useful things that you might want to take a note of. So if you notice, the way I began was by kind of introducing the idea by using that statement at the top of the task card, even before we get into the first cue. And I don't know if you noticed, but I did kind of paraphrase that statement. We said, when I was in my childhood. Now, of course, that's got the same meaning as when I was a child, which of course is what is written on that task card. So a bit of paraphrasing there. I wouldn't worry about this too much or focus on it, but kind of the more you practice speaking English, the more natural this will become, and you will be able to paraphrase very quickly and very easily. But it is something you have to work on a bit. And part 2 is a good opportunity for this because you do have time to think a bit and plan before you speak. Then we've said, of course, I grew up in a town just south of London. So we've given kind of the general location there, a town just south of London. And we've used the phrasal verb that we made a note of in our plan. I grew up, which of course means you spend your childhood somewhere. From when you're young to when you become an adult, you're growing up. So a nice phrasal verb to use there as well. Now, in the next sentence, we've just gone into a bit more detail. We're going from general to a bit more specific here. In fact, we can see we've used the word specific. The specific neighbourhood was just outside the town centre. So a bit more detail there. Nothing that incredible in terms of vocabulary there, but we've just gone into a bit more detail. Then we've even gone into more detail in the next sentence where we've almost given directions to this neighbourhood. We said there was a big road running from the high street past a big park. So we've got the high street, which is in the town centre, and there's a big road that comes past a big park. Now we've used the word there, notice, running, because a road can run from one place to another. That might seem strange to some of us who kind of are using English as a second language, and the word run, you might not have known that connects with the word road, but of course it can. A road can run from one place to another. And then more detail here, of course, my road was on the right straight after passing that park. So here, straight after just means immediately after. Okay, immediately after passing the park, you can see the road and you can turn right into that road. Then even more detail in the next sentence, and we use some of the words we made a note of as well. It was actually a dead end. And of course, this connects with the word we planned, which was cul-de-sac. So a dead end or a cul-de-sac means a road that is blocked off at one end, which means only really the people who live in the road are the ones driving down it, because you can't get through to the other side of the road. And again, we explain that a bit more in the sentence after that. This made it a quiet area as cars would rarely drive down the road. Again, you can see here, nothing that complex in terms of vocabulary, really. I'm just pointing out some of the things that are kind of naturally used by native speakers that might not come so natural to you if you're using English as a second language. And we've just gone from kind of general information to more specific information in our answer. Then, of course, we move on to the next cue, which was what kind of people lived there. So we focus now on the people, not the area. So the people living there were mostly young middle-class families. So the idea that we wrote down in the plan was young families. We've just added the word middle class there to describe those families in a bit more detail. Middle class, of course, meaning not really rich, but not poor, somewhere in the middle. So young middle class families, just describing the people in general. And we also give an example of kind of other kinds of people who lived there, but not in large numbers, although there were a few older retirees in a few of the houses. So we've got older retirees being people who are retired, people who aren't working anymore. Then we go into a bit more detail on those young middle-class families. The parents were often commuters, people who are traveling to and from work. this place is on the outskirts of London, so of course they're travelling into London every day to work, and we've just explained that. And of course their kids, we remember to mention them too, their kids would go to a nearby school just walking distance from the neighbourhood. So a nice word there, walking distance from an area. Well, this means it's not that far. You can walk from this place to another place. It's walking distance. So a nice word to use there. Then, of course, we move on to the third cue, which was what it was like in this neighbourhood. And this is where we really get to describe it in a lot of detail, giving lots of adjectives and describing it, kind of giving the examiner a kind of picture of this place in his mind. So the area was very pleasant. Pleasant, we're using that adjective that we made a note of. And then we describe it in a bit more detail. Both sides of the road were lined with Victorian semi-detached or detached houses. Now, if a road is lined with something, and this just means that it goes all the way down one side of the road. It's lined with something. Of course, we've said both sides of the road were lined with something there. So a bit of kind of maybe less common vocabulary there. And then we've described the style of the houses. They are Victorian, which means they were built during this period of time. Now probably, well over 100 years ago. And those houses are semi-detached or detached. Now, detached houses meaning kind of houses that are standing alone. They're not joined together with any other house. And a semi-detached house is, well, of course, where two houses share one wall. So your house is joined to another house, but not two houses, just one. It's semi-detached. So we have semi-detached and detached houses down the road. And also we've said that it felt like a pretty tight-knit community. So here we're using that phrase we made a note of in our plan, a tight-knit community, which of course means the people were quite close with each other. We all knew each other quite well. And we go into more detail in the next sentence and explain that. Children would often be playing together outside. So this means, of course, that children are close to each other. They play with each other. And it seemed like everyone knew each other quite well. So again, we're really going into more detail. Every time we're using an adjective, we're kind of showing that we really do understand that adjective by describing the situation in a bit more detail. Now, then we've gone on to explain the issues with parking that we made a note of in our ideas that we wanted to explain. There'd occasionally be issues. Notice here actually how we're making contractions. I'm not always mentioning this, but here, of course, instead of saying there would, we've got there'd. We're making a nice kind of natural contraction that a native speaker would do without even thinking. But this was usually when outsiders came to park their cars. So maybe a nice bit of vocabulary there. The word outsiders, meaning people who don't live there. They came to park in this area because they would have easy access to the town. And then we describe why, right? The location, again, we're repeating a bit from when we described in the first sentence, but we're changing it and explaining it in a different way. It was close to the shops, which of course is the high street, and next to a park, or the park that we mentioned before. And the people often came to take advantage of the convenient parking. So to take advantage of, to use something, to almost exploit something, because it's almost kind of describing this as maybe a slightly negative thing. Of course, to the people who lived there, it was a negative thing. To the people who were coming to park there, well, it wasn't negative to them. But I was living there, so I'll say they took advantage of the convenient parking. We're using the word convenient there, which we made a note of in the plan as well. Unfortunately, this would sometimes cause confrontations. Maybe confrontations is a new word for some of us. This just really means like a disagreement, right? That's happening face to face. Not quite a fight, of course, but maybe an uncomfortable situation where, people are having an argument in the street about where they're parking. And this would happen between locals, well, the people who lived in that area, and the strangers, well, synonym there of outsiders who came to park there. So we're just there describing in a bit more detail what it was like in this neighborhood. Mostly pleasant and nice and a convenient place, but also there'd be some negative things with parking in this area as well. Then we move on to talk about the final cue, which was whether we'd like to live there in the future. And there's not too much detail here, but we just explain our answer and why in a bit of detail. So we've said, I can't imagine I'd go back to live there again. Now, basically saying, no, I won't go back to live there. This is quite a common phrase, actually. I can't imagine. So, of course, literally, you can imagine it. But by saying I can't imagine, it just means, well, you don't think something will happen in the future. It's a nice phrase to remember if you want to talk about something in the future that you don't think is going to happen. So I can't imagine I'd go back to live there again. And then we just explain a bit more detail after that in the next sentence. My parents have moved out of the house to live somewhere else. So there, the phrase that we did make a note of in our plan, to move out. And they've moved out of, which of course means they've left that house. They don't live there anymore. They've sold that house and gone to live somewhere else. And also I've mentioned that the houses there are a bit too pricey for me. Too pricey meaning too expensive, and that was a bit of vocabulary that we noted down in our plan as well. And then I just end it by saying, well, however, if I did get an opportunity to live in there, I might consider it. So a nice kind of conditional sentence there at the end if we're mentioning some of the grammar. But there we go. Hopefully that answer there is really quite nice and clear to you. Hopefully you got a few things from it that you can take away and maybe use yourself, and some of the nice useful vocabulary and collocations that you can make a note of to learn from. But my advice would really be to go away and come up with your own ideas and answers to this task card and practice giving your answer, and see if you can extend your answer to be as long as, well, the sample answer that we were looking at in this video today. But I do hope it was useful, and if it was, do remember to click the like button, and if you haven't already, remember to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on any similar videos in the future. Thanks for watching, guys, and see you again in the next video.